Good morning,
Sure.
everyone. I am Addie Walton. I am the administrative assistant over here at the Library of Michigan Foundation, and welcome to our author conversation. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Aaron Robertson, who is the author of The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. In addition to being a Michigan Noble Book author, he is also a 2025 finalist for the Legacy Award presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation. Congratulations again, Aaron, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you, Eddie.
Absolutely. So to just get us started, could you give us some background on yourself and how you became a writer?
I was born and raised in Detroit, and writing was always a part of my life, really. I think I began drawing comic strips actually I must have been 6 or 7 years old, just kind of superhero comics or whatever. And I really was copying the comic strips that I saw, in books. But then I would draw the like dialogue bubbles, and
Hmm.
realize that that was a really powerful thing because I could make the characters say whatever I wanted them to say. And I think that sort of activated, something in me. I also had really influential teachers at a young age. My fourth grade teacher, Mr. Onicle, encouraged me to read White Fang, Jack
Mm.
London, it was sort of the first adult book that I read, or the, older book, which was really big for me. And then in fifth grade, I had a teacher, Mr. Haley, who was one of the first to really sort of believe in my this sense like that I had at that age that I would one day write a book. Like I was determined to write one, and he said, "All right, that's great, and we are going to focus on writing assignments in class." So really, it's these kind of foundational experiences that I had as a young person that made me think it was possible. But later in life, uh, I would get into literary translation. So I translate from Italian, and I would have these various experiences in journalism as a freelancer and also doing some work for the Detroit Metro Times here about 10 years ago and doing some interning for the New York Times, which I did in 2018. So I spent many years essentially trying to find my lane. Did I want to work in publishing? Did I want to translate mostly, or do journalism, or write books? And eventually, beginning in 2020, I would have the opportunity to focus on my first book.
That's amazing. And I want to ask you, tell us about your writing process and why you write in general, and if you can even talk about the different how your writing process differs based on your project. I know you mentioned you do sometimes translation, and then you were also doing some freelancing and journalism, and now you have, of course, this book. So tell me how that writing process differs from project to project.
Yeah. I really could use a set ritual, like just one way of doing a writing project, I think would probably be helpful for me. But no, like you said, it really it depends on the nature of the project. So, I worked in publishing for a while, mostly as an editor, and my way into publishing was through the world of literary translation. So, in college, I majored in Italian, and I also studied African American, I like African American studies. And I was interested in finding an overlap between those two fields that eventually led me to learning about the history of the African diaspora in Italy. And I discovered the work of an author named Ijeaba Shego. She is a second generation Somali Italian woman who was born and raised in Rome, and she writes all kinds of things. She's been a journalist. She's written, memoirs. She has written, novels. And I was studying in Italy in Bologna in 2016, and I found one of her books called Beyond Babylon. And I read it like in Italian, and I loved it. It was this sort of sweeping tale about the rise of totalitarianism in Italy, Argentina, Somalia,
Oh,
and
wow.
Tunisia. And so real, intergenerational kind of epic. And so I had never really translated before, but I had to do senior thesis project. And so instead of doing a research one, because I was kind of lazy, I proposed that I do a creative thesis and I wanted to translate this book. So that was really my first experience with translating. I started off with the goal of, you know, translating 10 pages a day for the first draft. It helped like that I had a, deadline. And that was that. But, future translation projects would the way that I approached them just completely varied depending on the point in my life and the nature of the project. I've translated a mix of fiction and nonfiction. And, I view literary translation as kind of the most enjoyable sort of puzzle. It's a big
Mm,
puzzle piece. It's a big, like puzzle set. And so that scratched one part of my my brain, I guess.
hmm
With journalism, again, it helps that usually there is a deadline like that I'm given. And so that allows me to, to structure my time in a very specific way. It's more short term. Um, but with the book, with the Black Utopians, um, that process was all over the place. It began as a series of two essays actually that I wrote for a magazine called The Point, which is based in Chicago.
mm,
And the book is sort of about uh, Black utopian communities as they have existed from the 19th century on. The book is largely historical, but there's also a personal part of the story in it as well. My paternal grandfather was born in the small town west of Nashville, called Promised Land. And Promised Land was founded um, by freed persons, like in the years following the Civil War. And so I wrote about Promised Land and this church in Detroit called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, which was a Black nationalist church that began actually in the 50s, but in the 60s it became a real part of the Black countercultural moment. So I wanted to weave together these stories, and I did that through the essay. Um, After that was published, which was in June 2020, I was approached by two, different literary agents who asked me if I had an idea for a book. I had not planned to write a book, but when someone comes asking if you have an idea, I don't think you say no. You say,
right.
I don't, we can work on it, I guess. So I chose one agent, and over the course of that whole summer and into the fall, we worked on a proposal, for the book. We sold the idea at the end of 2020, right after the election, actually, and then I would write the book over the course of 3 years. And there was no, I didn't have a schedule. I wrote when I could,
Right.
um, and that's how it happened.
That's really amazing. I think that's so interesting because I've tried to write myself sometimes, and I think having a writing routine or ritual is important, but also so hard to pin down and actually create. And there's just so many different ways of approaching it. Especially when I was reading your book, I could tell you put so much research into it. I mean, you had all this historical information you were going off of, but also drawing from your own cultural and familial memory and framework. So can you tell me a bit about that research process as well? How do you go about picking kind of the best pieces to include in your book and make it a final product? Because I'm sure you were just had a wealth of information at times that you knew probably couldn't make it into the final book.
That is an understatement. Yes. There was so much. Well, you know, I was interested in this idea of the Black utopianism. So one, like I think there is a tendency to think to conceive of utopianism as indulging in, impractical, fantasies and kind of dreaming, but having no real plan to enact these dreams to create the world that you want to see. Um, I was not the first person to write about Black utopian, traditions or communities, but I wanted to write a narrative account, focused on very specific examples of what it meant to embody Black utopianism, which really it's both about imagining radical alternatives to the world that we see in front of us, a world that so often disenfranchises all kinds of people, uh, Black people among them, but also what were the practical, material, tangible ways that, some of these people and communities attempted to create these alternative worlds, Um, I was aware that I was introducing this idea to a broad audience, trade audience. And because of that, I felt really compelled to do a lot of different kinds of research. So, um, for the book, I was doing a combination of deep archival research, particularly into the history of the Shrine of the Black Madonna and its pastor, whose name was Albert Clay Jr. I was learning about him, about his theology, his, motivations. I was doing a lot of, secondary source, consultation, reading broad histories about American utopian traditions, generally. So thinking of groups like the Quakers, Shakers, the sort of 19th century utopian socialist, etc. And I think the real heart of the book came from my, interviews that I did with people. So both family members who could talk about, Promised Land and the role that it played in our own family, but also people who generally were a part of the sort of 1960s and 70s countercultural moment, particularly in Detroit. These were people who could speak to the spread of communes, right? And the sort of rise of the new left in this country and responses to urban rebellions. Like what was it like to live during this period of social tumult and social transformation, and really believe that this was an era where all kinds of change was possible. I think without these conversations with people who actually lived through these historical turning points, I think the book would have been very different and
Right.
probably quite dry.
Thank you. Um, so how would you define this work, especially you talk about in your introduction, I think, about how Promised Land and other examples of Black utopias act as tangible proofs that utopia is possible, at least in terms of everyday disruption of rhythms of constrictiveness. So how do you view or define your work in terms of that?
Mhm. It was my intention to write, like, and this sounds a little like grandiose, but I wanted to write a historical, like, epic about like Black utopianism. And so the book is, it is largely historical, but it's narrative nonfiction. So it was important for me to both inform readers about the broad nature of Black utopian thought,
Hmm.
but also to ground that in specific, characters and stories. I wanted the lives of these characters to reflect all kinds of dreams about land ownership, about, education, radical education models for Black children. I wanted to write about Black political radicalism, and uh, innovations in art making, and all of this, right? I also, in a way, was engaging with the tradition of utopian literature. So much of, like when we think of sort of like classic utopian tales, there's usually this genre convention that you have an outside observer who like randomly comes upon this, like a magical island, or this like society where everything seems, either perfect, or uh the way that the world unfolds just looks so unfamiliar. I began with the intention of writing about the Shrine of the Black Madonna and the the movement that started there called Black Christian nationalism, with this kind of framework. Like me as the person who didn't really know what this world was about, but wanted to engage in it. But as I wrote more, it became clear that, like it was really impossible to separate my own story and sort of, yearnings and insecurities from the story of the shrine. The
Hmm.
shrine represented a kind of, socially engaged relationship with Christianity that I did not experience as a child. I grew up Christian, I grew up Baptist, but the kinds of churches that I was going to did not emphasize political transformation. They were not
Hmm.
interested explicitly in talking about, social programs to like change the world. So I was learning about this church and was thinking, oh my gosh, like I grew up not far from the shrine. My
Right.
grandparents lived like 10 minutes away from the church, but I didn't actually know about it until 2019. So
Oh,
like
wow.
a year before I started writing about the church. Um, so th all of these experiences would ultimately determine the sort of shape and form of the book, which moves between all kinds of registers, the broadly historical and the very intimate, sort of character-based form of storytelling.
Speaking of characters, you talk about a lot about your own family as well as, of course, Albert Clegg, who was a central figure in your book and that movement as well. What are some of your favorite characters or moments from your book?
One of the character, I mean, the character who I liked writing about the most was a man named Glanton Dowdell. Glanton was a Black nationalist, and activist and artist who is best remembered for painting the mural that gives the Shrine of the Black Madonna its name. So in 1967, he was commissioned to paint an 18-foot tall by 9 foot wide mural of a Black Madonna and child, which you can imagine at that time, like in the late 60s, was a uh, controversial, image. And he was involved in so much in the city of Detroit. He helped establish the local chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was involved in the well-known, labor group, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And so he just had a fascinating life. which became even more interesting in the late 1960s because he was involved with so many groups in Detroit. He began to fear that federal authorities were attempting to assassinate him. And
Mhm.
that at the time was not an unusual fear because
Right.
happening to people like Fred Hampton, COINTELPRO was very active targeting people like Albert Flagg Jr., like Glanton himself. So eventually he decides that it is, safest for him to leave the US. And with the help of these young Swedish leftists who are very sympathetic to sort of the plight of Black radicals, like in the US, who are also very vocal against the Vietnam War. A group of these people helps Glanton Dowdell self-exile to Sweden in 1969, where he lives for the rest of his life until he dies in 2000. And so his story was, some people who are local, who are interested in the history of Black, labor uh, activity in the city might have heard of him, but his story had never really been told. And so just, lingering in that narrative, like in a story that goes from, uh, Glanton Dowdell's childhood in poverty in the Black Bottom neighborhood of Detroit to, years later, him, being in Stockholm and being sort of the face of the the Black American like labor movement for these young Swedes. It was too hard it was hard to pass that up. It was so tantalizing. So I would say that he was definitely the most kind of fun to write about in the book.
For sure. And he was definitely the most fascinating for me personally to read about, especially because, again, I think it goes back to those tangible proofs of utopia you're talking about. I mean, creating that image of the Black Madonna, um, such a radical image, especially at the time. And it was just so fascinating to think about how maybe just his own process of creating and painting and being involved with the labor movement, how that might have been his own form of disrupting the pattern. And I was wondering for you, when you write, do you find your writing or your writing process a form of building that your own vision of Black utopia, or how do you see any parallels between you and Glanton Dowdle, or just how art itself and the process of creating itself can be a form of utopia?
Yeah. You know, I have sort of come to think about utopia as something that describes a kind of relationship between people, right? Like a an imaginative and, sustaining relationship between people that like enables us to envision, different realities than those like that we have in front of us, but also that sort of give us the energy to keep going.
Mhm.
And when it comes to my own writing, I am very interested in telling stories, particularly about Black American history, that have not had much exposure, if at all, in mainstream narratives and in sort of, mainstream like channels to get this information, because it's my hope that people can see themselves reflected like in these old stories that just have not really been told. Um, and so I don't know if that I don't know if that goal is utopian or not, but it is what drives me. And it's these kinds of stories that exist either outside of or on the peripheries of conventional archives that interest me.
for sure, especially because, as you say, like Detroit has become shorthand for dystopian. It has just become the butt of the joke in terms of America and being from Metro Detroit and coming from Inkster, which is its own, has cannibalized itself and also been cannibalized by the larger country. It is definitely important and interesting and powerful to have these stories brought to the forefront in the collective consciousness. But I wanted to ask you, what does it mean for you to have your work selected as a Michigan Noble book?
It's so cool. You know, I grew up in this state. I grew up going to let's see, the Hubbard branch of the Detroit Public Library, you know,
Yes.
as a kid. My 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 grandma would, you know, like force me to go because I was playing too many video games and watching too much TV. And so, you know, the experiences of reading in this state, but also in the Detroit Public Library, you know, system came to mean so much to me. And just yeah, to have written a book that is you know is now a part of the sort of broader Library of Michigan family feels so so special. And also you know, having had the opportunity to speak to various communities throughout Michigan has made this whole process just feel more worthwhile. I think that the vast majority of people write to connect with people, and so being able to have conversations with people in person has definitely been been super meaningful to me.
Absolutely. And to touch more on that, why do you think people should read your book, The Black Utopians? What are they going to get out of it when they're going through this?
You know, I think it really is for people who are interested in understanding um, like a spirit of like countercultural optimism that is not divorced from real challenges in the world, right? Like, and this is a spirit that has existed, you know, forever, really. You know, because of my own relationship to Detroit, which has been sort of a challenging one and has changed with time. Um, you know, it felt important for me to tell this story with within the framework of Detroit history. I think it's also a book for people who are a little tired of uh, mainstream stories about Detroit as this place of despair, you know, and blight and all of this. There have always been people in the city who viewed Detroit as nothing but a site of possibility, you know. And it's those narratives that I have been more interested in than anything else.
For sure. And kind of bringing back to the beginning of our conversation, you asked me about what I was reading currently, but what are some writers or works that you found yourself reading recently?
Ooh, so much. I'm reading random things now. I'm reading a history of Singapore for some reason
Ooh.
because yeah, which is interesting. I have been uh revisiting the work of one of my favorite authors, Leon Forrest. He taught at the University of Chicago for a long time. His one of his editors actually was Toni Morrison.
Oh, wow.
And he's a fantastic writer who sort of blends African American, you know, sacred and folk you know, traditions and literary conventions with, you know, Greek myths, and all of his stories are deeply elusive and kind of linguistically dense and challenging. And I just love that stuff. I love stuff that forces me to kind of stop and reread, you know, passages.
Absolutely. Um, is there anything else that you want people to know about either you or your process as a writer or the Black Utopians itself? I mean, I feel like you talk about so much in terms of connecting with not only the histories of cities, but also connecting with your own familial history as a part of the process and really bringing up histories and disfranchisement. Oh my God, I can't speak. Histories of despair and kind of
Mm.
rewrite those as histories of potential and perseverance. So, is there anything else you would like to leave people with?
Yeah, like I would just say that the story of the Shrine of the Black Madonna is so deeply a part of the story of late 20th century Detroit. And you know, because Reverend Clegg, like in the period directly after the rebellion in 1967, he really became the face of a movement that comprised, you know, younger Black radicals who were tired of the way things were, you know, in the city and wanted radical transformation. And so if you are interested in that time period in Detroit and what the years afterwards were like, then I think this story could have a lot in it for you as a reader.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was a pleasure talking to you, especially because I worked at Cattle and I missed your your tour stop at Foster. So it's
Um,
been a pleasure to meet you and talk with you and talk about the Black Utopians. It's one of my favorite books. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, Addie. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.